Hello and welcome to All Church Sunday School. My name is Shannon Moore. Things look a little different than normal. Renee was not able to be with us this week, and so I am going to attempt to lead us through the first chapter of An Altar in the World. This is the book that we started last week, and it is by Barbara Brown Taylor, and it is just finding ways to connect with God in different ways than sometimes we think possible. So before we get started, let's begin with a word of prayer. Gracious and loving God, thank you for this day. Thank you for this opportunity to gather in this way to talk about holy things, to talk about the ways that you are involved in our lives in so many new and unexpected ways, and yet not unexpected because you've always done that. Open our hearts and our minds to the workings of your Holy Spirit today and every day. Amen. Well, the first chapter of this book is titled The Practice of Waking Up to God, and I hope that you were able to order this book this week and that you have read chapter 1, but if not, no big deal. We're just going to hit some highlights from this chapter and see what you think about it. I hope you'll send me an email this week with your reflections on this chapter. She begins this chapter with a quote that says, "The day of my spiritual awakening was the day I saw and knew I saw all things in God and God in all things." Matilde of Magdeburg is who she attributed that to. And then she starts talking about a visit that she took to Hawaii and how she was walking on this earth that was new earth because a local volcano was constantly making new earth, and she felt a different energy in that earth than she did anywhere else. She described it as adolescent because the very earth upon which she was walking was new and how different that felt. And she talks about, and I really resonated with this, the different energies in different places, and how had she been raised in the deserts of Arizona, she would be a very different person than the person she is who grew up in Kansas and later in Atlanta. That speaks to me as well. I have often thought how the places where we walk, the places where we live and grow up, resonate with us in different ways. I know when I first moved to Texas from North Carolina and first drove west from Fort Worth on the way to West Texas, how vulnerable and exposed I felt because there weren't any trees. I was accustomed to being surrounded by trees, and to not have that sort of feeling of protection felt strange to me. So as she's walking in Hawaii and hearing all these crashing waves and that sort of thing, she stumbles upon a tidal pool, and there's absolute silence there. And she recognizes, wow, something different is happening here. And then she sees that somebody has stacked up 3 stones up one against the other. And she knows that she's not the first person who has been in this place, and she's not the first person who experienced something deeper there. Someone has set up an altar. And it reminded her of a Bible story, and I'm going to share that with you. It's the story of Jacob, who, after bamboozling his brother out of their father's blessing, has to take off for fear of his life. And this is Genesis chapter 28, starting at verse 10. Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran. He came to a certain place and stayed there for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place. And he dreamed that there was a ladder set up on the earth, the top of it reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And the Lord stood beside him and said, "I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. and your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south, and all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and in your offspring. Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." Then Jacob woke from his sleep and said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." And he was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." So Jacob rose early in the morning, and he took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on the top of it. He called that place Bethel, that is, house of God. Here ends that reading. "Remember that I am with you," God said. "I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised." Barbara Brown Taylor says that this was one of those dreams that I think we all have from time to time, where you just know you couldn't make it up, that there's something special, that there was something different about it, that God is saying something. This idea that Jacob was able to set up a temple in this new way, this house of God, recognizing that it doesn't have to be 4 walls and a roof and a steeple in order to be a place where God is. That said, she also talks about the many churches she has loved in her life. And I know that there have been many churches that I've loved in my life. I know when I think of the church of my childhood, I can smell the smell of it, the lemon oil. I can smell, I don't know, I always called it a mixture of pledge and holiness, that I can see the green carpet, I can see the knotty pine on the ceiling and on halfway up the walls, and it's a very special place for me. And I would like for you to take just a moment and reflect upon a church or a sacred place that has special meaning for your life. So understanding that there are these special places, Taylor then says, "Who had persuaded me that God preferred 4 walls and a roof to wide open spaces?" And she talks about the security that exists in the physical boundaries of having a church, and how that can be a trapping in a way, that we fall into this idea that we have to be at the church or in the church or involved in something at the church in order to be connected with God. And she talks about how she had, and others that she knows had, this deep longing, to do something different, to be in deeper relationship with God. And so she says, we volunteered more, dreamed up more programs, invited more people to more classes where we could read more books. But the minute we walked back out to our cars, many of us could feel the same old gnawing inside. Once we left the church, we were not sure what to do anymore. That's a really powerful passage, I think. And then she says, we had forgotten that the whole world is the house of God. I want to read this passage to you. She's talking about the idea that God is in more places in the church, that the church is so important, and that there are large swaths of the world filled with people in deep need of saving. But this is what she says about that. The problem is many of the people in need of saving are in churches, and at least part of what they need saving from is the idea that God sees the world the same way they do. What if the gravel of a parking lot looks as promising to God as the floorboards of a church? What if a lost soul strikes God as more reachable than a lifelong believer? What if God can drop a ladder absolutely anywhere with no regard for the religious standards developed by those who have made it their business to know the way to God? I could not possibly say. I want to invite you for just a few moments to think about something surprising that God has revealed to you at some point in your life, some revelation when you knew that God was speaking something surprising to you. Take just a few moments and reflect on that. Going back to the story of Jacob, Barbara Brown Taylor says that when he set up that altar, when he set up that stone upon which his head had laid, perhaps she said that dream came from the stone, or perhaps that dream came down from heaven, but there was something holy about it. He used it to set up this altar in the world, seeing that the divine could erupt anywhere, that when he did that, there was no temple in Jerusalem. There was no one place set apart for people to worship. Later, when the Israelites would wander in the wilderness for all of those years, there was the tent, the tabernacle that God resided in. Not solely, God met them in other places as well, but it was the place where Moses could be in God's presence. And whenever he would be in that tent with God, when he came out, he would have to cover his face so that people wouldn't be scared at how brightly it shone. When King David, later in the Old Testament, wanted to build a temple, God said, I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt. I've been moving about in a tent and a tabernacle. God does not have to be confined into a space. And then Barbara Brown Taylor, I keep saying her whole name because I don't know if she goes by Brown Taylor or if she just goes by Taylor. She says, do we build God a house in lieu of having God stay at ours? She says, what happens to the rest of the world when we build 4 walls, even 4 gorgeous walls, cap them with a steeple, and designate that is the house of God? What happens to the riverbanks, the mountaintops, the deserts, and the trees? What happens to the people who never show up at our houses of God? And then she reminds us of St. Francis, who saw God in everything. His human brothers and sisters, but also the sun and the moon and the animals and the plants. Everything was sacred. She says St. Francis could not have told you the difference between the sacred and the secular if you twisted his arm behind his back. For him, a leper was as kissable as a bishop's ring, a single bird as much a messenger of God as a cloud full of angels. I love that. Think for just a moment about places you have seen God in either nature or in some unexpected place. Near the end of this chapter, she tells us that God shows up in whirlwinds and in the stars and in burning bushes and in strangers. And when people want to know more about God, the Son of God tells them to pay attention to the lilies of the field and the birds of the air, to women needing bread and to workers lining up for their pay. This is wonderful news, she says. I do not have to choose between the Sermon on the Mount and the magnolia tree. I love that sentence. That is, there's a lot of power in that. One of the things that I've been experiencing more and more over the past several years as I've been trying to deepen my faith is this idea of both and instead of either or so often God is so much more expansive. I think most of the time God is so much more expansive than we can fathom, that we try to put labels and rules on God, and God just keeps expanding those boundaries and opening God's arms even wider and wider. Wisdom, she says, is not gained by knowing what is right, but by practicing what is right. If you're not sure what to believe about washing feet, the best way to find out is to practice washing a pair or two. She says if you don't know about your neighbor's faith, invite them to dinner, share a meal with them. Wisdom atrophies if it's not walked on a daily basis. When God speaks to us in these unexpected and surprising ways, we have a choice. We can ignore it. We can put it off as a fluke, as a mistake. Surely God's not speaking to us. Barbara Brown Taylor says maybe we had had too much caffeine, or can say, well, God would never appear to me in a vision, or to push it off and say, I've got too much to do today. I don't have time to deal with this right now. And then I want to read what she says. You can do all that stuff. Or I can set a little altar in the world or in my heart. I can stop what I am doing long enough to see where I am, who I am there with, and how awesome the place is. I can flag one more gate to heaven, one more patch of ordinary earth with ladder marks on it, where the divine traffic is heavy when I notice it, and even when I do not. I can see it for once instead of walking right past it, maybe even setting a stone or saying a blessing before I move on to wherever I am due next. Human beings may separate things into as many piles as we wish, separating spirit from flesh, sacred from secular, church from world. But we should not be surprised when God does not recognize the distinctions we make between the two. Earth is so thick with divine possibility that it's a wonder we can walk anywhere without cracking our shins on altars. Very interesting chapter. Waking up to God, finding God in unexpected places. So my prayer for you this week is that you will, and I will, together we will, open our hearts and our minds to see God in unexpected places, to not assume that God's not speaking to us, to know that we are loved just as all of our siblings around the world are loved. And I hope that you have a blessed week. Let everybody know that we belong to Christ by the way we love each other. Have a great week. We'll see you next time.